And of course, we have Professor Bernard Lanskey from the Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University, Australia. And he's here to talk about Debussy Etudes Book 2. And in line with the theme of music, conflict, and harmony, he's here to bring about for the opposing sonorities. So, yes, let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Lanskey.
Hi, folks. So what I want to do in this session is very much invite you to give me your thoughts about conflict and harmony, and then I will engage with a piece of music that Debussy wrote 110 years ago to see if we can find how he might use the same ideas you did. But I want to begin by giving you some insight into who Debussy was and where he was at the time of this piece that I'll be sharing with you. Who here has played any Debussy? I thought quite a few of you would have done. Who has played any music of late Debussy, so in his the last 4 or 5 years of his life? Most of the music that's famous is sort of very early. I mean, it's around 1900, Clair de Lune, or the Preludes, or whatever, even the Children's Corner Suite. So these are all pieces that come from a slightly earlier period. So just very quickly, Debussy was born in 1862. He sort of became quite suddenly famous only in his 30s, and very famous in his 40s. And this is music from his 50s. So all the way through his 40s, he was a celebrity in Paris and indeed globally. In fact, I've seen a book written in 1905 in England that was talking about the 40-year-old Debussy, piece by piece. Could you imagine now that we would be writing about a composer, 40-year-old composer from Malaysia or Myanmar or Laos, the week after, the year after the music has been written, or indeed even in Europe, whether the Germans would be at all aware of what was going on in Paris last year in terms of output. So the idea of this music being really present. But what happened around the time of when he turned about 52 is quite different. So just first of all, the geopolitics of the situation. So what happened in 1914? The number that we know, World War I. So first of all, obviously, exactly. So suddenly, where Paris was full of life and vigor, the motor car had come along, the silent film was full of life, people were partying all the time, and suddenly along comes a world war. And it's World War I. So it's like the first time the whole world felt like it was at war. Debussy was a composer. What does a composer do to help bring peace? Well, for Debussy, for the first year, he had no clue. He was completely without any role to play. Partly because at the same time as the world went to war, Debussy found out he had cancer and that he was very likely to die from the cancer. So here he was in a war where lots of people, lots of the youth of France were being mown down, that's his words, by the Boche, as he put it. And he personally was fighting his own battle. There was an internal conflict of where would he find himself. And for a year, he couldn't write any music. If you come tonight I'm performing this piece tonight, so I don't want to give too many clues away before tonight, but tonight will be a sort of sound and vision collage. And we'll look through at some of the complex conflicts between his own circumstances and those of the people around him, and also that concept of internal and external. The images that come up tonight are probably too fast, deliberately too fast, in fact, to process fully in real time, just as arguably many pieces of music, more profound music, can be too fast to process in real time. And other music goes into us so deeply that we're not meant to process it at all so much as to feel and live it. We saw that in the last presentation, for example, how the music isn't about what your conscious thinking is, it's about your connection with each other that comes through the music. So I'm just got some simple questions let's go into theory for a bit. Really, really basic theory. If I talked about conflicting interval, or two notes that would be conflicting as intervals, what sort of intervals come into play for you? What sort of sonorities would be opposing, as he puts it? What would be two opposing notes? If you're going to put a note and another note that was in conflict with it, give me some examples. The minor second, exactly, perfect. And by extension, its inversion, which would be the major seventh. So these notes that are actually, in one sense, really close to each other, and in another sense totally opposed. So very like Germany and France in the First World War, they're next door to each other. If Debussy, for example, had walked from where he lived when he was writing this piece to the place of conflict, he could have actually done it in a day. It was that close, it's that adjacent. So this intense adjacency that sometimes creates the biggest conflict. And we see that a lot in the world today, people next door to each other in states of incredible conflict. So that's one example, beautiful. And what's another interval that is often shared? There's a few of them, but the other really strong interval that comes into play melodically.
Tritone.
The tritone. Okay. Now the tritone is really interesting because where the minor second and the major seventh are very close to each other, the tritone is an interval that is as far away from the other note as it can be. So that's one thing. There's one possibility for opposition, and I want to work through some of those to show how it might work in this music. Now when we look at opposing musical textures, so let's think more about harmonies. When we talk about harmonies that are not in conflict, what sort of chordal types come into play for you? Sorry? Major. So the chord would be the major triad, for example, and the scales would be what sort of? So scales, for example, often work in harmony. They're notes that know each other well. They hang out together. That's why they form sort of scales. So the idea that when we get into harmony, those harmonies that will be perhaps really simple would be the ones that we would see as harmonious rather than as conflicting. Now, just for a moment, because obviously we haven't got a lot of time today, put those two things together. If you had a conflict from two notes that were a minor second apart, and you wanted to somehow put a conception of harmony with them, what might you try and do, and how could that work? I mean, so the harmonies would need to be potentially triadic, but the melodic intervals are conflicting. So there's a really obvious answer I'm sort of seeking here, which is you would take, give me some thought. You've got two notes and you've got triadic harmonies. What would you try to do with the two chords? Well, I'm actually looking, I'll answer this one because it's really fair enough that it would be a conflicting question. What happens if you put the two major triads on those two adjacent notes next to each other? It would be horrific, wouldn't it? I mean, let me play it to you. It's a cluster, exactly. So it would be this. So that's obviously a highly conflicting sound. Fair enough? How could you possibly help it find harmony? What have you got at your disposal with harmonies to help them feel more consonant? I've done something very deliberate there, so by putting them... Yes, please.
Change the octave of one of the triads.
Exactly, so that's even more complex than the concept of you might spread the sonorities out over a period of time. So basically, these are games that Debussy plays in this piece. And I'll share some of them here. I hope you can come to the concert at 6:30, where some of these things will become much more diverse through time, because these raw materials become things that he plays with much more eloquently, and it's clear that he spent a lot of time thinking about these pieces. So as I say, for 12 months he couldn't write anything. It was almost, there's a quote which tonight we'll start with, which is, "All I know is how to compose. If I can't compose," he literally says, "I might as well be dead." And then he also says, "I should therefore try and compose," but he says, "What is the point of knocking your head when everything you hear is hollow?" So the idea that nothing is coming out of him. All his life he's taken creation for granted. So he went into a very, very dark place. To help his state of mind, he went to the seaside to get out of Paris. He also was keeping up with what was happening in the war. He was also, who knows that Debussy was a really beautiful writer as well as composer? It's probably less known, but he was a musical critic. He wrote lots and lots of letters. So we know what he was thinking about the music he was making through his letters. We talked at the beginning about pieces you might have played like Clair de Lune or some of the preludes, and they all had names and they all had images that were obviously sources of inspiration for him. At the end of his life, quite famously, he was writing sonatas and etudes, so it sounded like he stopped having images. I have a different perspective, which was that he was so tired of people asking him questions about the images that he'd given titles to, that he decided that he would stop telling you. You had to go and find what the images might be. And if you read his letters, particularly of the First World War, you'll find every single sentence is a metaphor, is an image, it's something that would inspire him to make music. But the difference now is it becomes a little bit like detective work to imagine what might have been inspiring him. At one point in 2015, about the time he wrote this piece, he wrote how horrible it was, not just that people were dying, but that the cultural potential of our country was, a generation of it was being wiped out. And then he wrote, the only thing I can do is make music that takes us to a more special, pleasant, imaginary place. And I will write my music will be a secret homage to the people who died. This piece used to have a title before its current title. It was For the Sonorities Replaced or Extinguished. So we all have a voice, our sonority. So a potential thing in this is that your sonority is being replaced by the next people in the trenches who are being killed, or the people who are being extinguished as we go along. In total, Debussy wrote 12 etudes. As he put it on the fly, he wrote them very quickly, so he suddenly was highly inspired. most of them have titles like for the fourths, or for the repeated notes, or for the chromatic notes, or for arpeggios, or they almost sound like they're technical things. This one is for the opposing sonorities, so it stands out as a piece quite unlike, I believe, any of the other 11. Going back to this point of sound that is conflict, that might revolve harmony, let me just give you a few quick examples here, and then we'll just look at the examples. You can see the score up here, hopefully you can get a sense of it, and you'll also see that I've given you cheat sheets with some of the markings in here, so you can see where the chromaticisms are and so on. That very first idea, which is immediately this idea of the second, the minor second, the G sharp and the A clashing with each other, but spread out tonally across the whole range. If it was in the world of metaphors, does it suggest anything to you? Where would you hear that sound outside, for example, perhaps in the evenings in Bangkok?
Like natural sounds.
No, this is actually more. This is a human sound, but it's a human sound which we hear in different situations across all of Southeast Asia. I'll try again. Maybe I take it out of time helps. Any thoughts? A natural setting with a human sound that might come over the top of it. So what I'm imagining is the gong. Gongs playing through time, seemingly in collision with each other, but ultimately creating a potential harmony. So you've heard this often.
Shimmering tones.
Sorry?
Enzer would call it shimmering tones.
Shimmering thought, exactly. So just this idea, exactly. So it's just, it hangs in the air, but there's a collision in the bells ringing against each other. For Debussy, it was a very specific image, which we know, which is bells used to ring at certain times of the day in the Catholic religion to call people's attention to prayer. And obviously you get similar things in other religions. But he actually left a quote around the time of this piece, which is the Angelus, which is the noonday bells calling to prayer. The Angelus is ringing timidly, as if it knows it cannot reach men's hearts. So it's absolutely a concept of a bell ringing which should call us to a position of hope. But in his concept was no one would ring it quite as assuredly in 1914 as they might have done in 1913. And then the next interval we get the augmented fourth. So this is a piece full of these collisions. And then adjacent seconds. The bells still ring. So you'll hear all the way through the music, this play with conflicts that are near each other. Sometimes you get a sense of, as you can see it at the bottom of the first page, for example, semitonal walking, like trudging along as so on. Or you get another thing which is a very clear image from the First World War of the bugle. So as a conflict with these intervals, suddenly the sense of hope, the arising fifths, being played with. And so you get to the top of the second page. And then suddenly a different sonic world, possibly in conflict with the previous sounds before, but somehow offering hope, and then somehow putting them together. Now this chord is quite amazing. The very top of the page, it's actually, it's easier if I just play them. It's like a major seventh, or is it a dyad of F? It's F sharp versus, it's F sharp triad, and F major dyad, with a G sharp in the bass. But you begin to get this idea of a single sonority that could have opposing meanings. And Debussy helps it at the top of this page by writing that the first one should be sweet, the second one should be marked, and the third one should be expressive and, sorry, I can't quite read it, penetrative, isn't it? Yes, expressive and penetrative. So the idea you're going to have the same sound 3 times with 3 different meanings. Now what could you do to help the same sound have 3 different meanings? On a piano. Not only on a piano.
Different voicing.
Different voicing, absolutely. So what voicing you come up with, well, that's up to you. But the idea that the metaphor would be to find a sweet sound, to find a sort of declaimed sound, and to find an expressive and penetrating sound. So as a piano lesson for everybody through every sound you ever make into the future, those 3 bars are particularly telling. And as I say, it's F sharp major triad with an F major dyad. Now, it's arguably not fully conflicting, because you can actually hear and the third time it turns into a melody. So it takes us somewhere. Now, just in terms of material and how you might explore it and go deeper and reflect upon it, at you can see there's a whole section which these sort of chords of Fs and F sharps become more beautiful and juicy. Something that is got more joy in it. It's still full of dissonances, but suddenly the spacing of the chords and the sense of energy and the direction and the reach takes us to a different place. But then suddenly, out of the blue, no, it's not 1912, it's 1915. The same musical material, now like a memory of the past. And then listen to what happens. Then he writes calm. So suddenly he finds for us a way that opposing sonorities can create the most delicious sense of peace. It sounds better on a knife this time, I suppose, but something of the sense of that sonority as we work through it. Debussy has a sense of proportion in everything he writes, so you'll find a lot of palindromic elements in this piece. Like you've been on a journey, you remember that journey, and then you come back, you shape through time so that the beginning and end are like each other. The middle is the point where the mirror comes into play. So those are the sorts of things you'll find happening on this piece. The other thing you'll find that are conflicts that find possibly harmony are sudden juxtapositions of peace and threat. Now, in a performative context, I mean, this is all looking at the music without thinking about how we might project it into a performance in the 21st century. The game tonight will be to be giving some images to share with this, but what I've found just listening to some of the presentations today is also how you begin to think about the theatrics of a performance of this when you're trying to take something forward. So just as a very specific example, you can see the conflict of this bar and this bar is pretty profound, even though the harmonic material is very, very similar. You go from fortissimo to pianissimo. You go from an incredibly widespread chord here to incredibly closed in here. And you don't do it with some sort of Mozartian transition where it happens so subtly you don't notice it. It's instant. And so how to convey a sense of shock at that moment in a performative space to get here. Fortunately, it does your brain in a bit as well, so there's a bit of internal shock at that moment. But how to play with that is the sort of thing you might start trying to work out as you're projecting pieces to have potentially more impact for a broader audience than they might have just if you sat down and played the piece. So if you are there tonight, what I'd be suggesting is to listen for the moments that are strongly dissonant, to try and remember, to trust your subconscious memory that it will remember. If you don't try and remember, so I've said the wrong thing, don't try and remember, just be in the space. But to listen for almost like the bells of memory, the bells of what were the dissonances, what were these consonants, what do these potential possibilities of consonance and dissonance mean in terms of painting a richer picture of meaning. This piece happens in about 4 minutes, and I'm going to play with it a little bit today to let the images sink in a bit, but it's about 4 minutes long. But if you look at how much time it would have taken Debussy to craft it, and how much he will have been thinking about the story through the music, his life through this piece of music. The real people he knew were at the trenches being filled, the generation below him that he could do nothing for. So as he's playing this music, he's connecting to something that is so much deeper than the sounds it makes. I remember a few years ago sharing here a sort of quirky show which was called The Sound of Music, and the idea that music, as Christian Zimmerman says, music is not just sound. It uses sound to express something. So that idea of coming back and exploring any piece of music for what could you share that transcends the sound, but how do you reflect it in sound and how do you reflect it beyond sound in the 21st century? So I was really grateful to Mrs. Galliani for this year's topic. I first remember the first time I remember the first time I heard this piece. It was on a recording at the Royal College of Music about 40 years ago. And I always thought I would love one day to play that piece. But this conference has been the inspiration to actually go away and learn it and explore and reflect on it. So to go looking for thematic possibilities that are all around us in art and finding ways to share them. hope you can be there tonight. Looks like a really wonderful concert. And 5 minutes of it will be this piece. Many other pieces will be much longer. Thank you.
Any questions or reactions?
Could you show us the name of the piece again?
Sure, it's, yes, sure. So it's up there. It's for it's very at the top. It's for the sonorité opposée, which is for the opposing sonorities. So it's number 10 of the, which is in book 2 of the Debussy Etudes from 1916. Yeah. But actually, book 2 is, as a whole set, is once you start looking at these sort of imagery and so on, there's ways in which you can see he's put the pieces deliberately side by side each other to take you on a sort of poetic journey. And this is right in the middle, if you like, number 10 of, so number 4 of 6, if you see book 2 as a separate set. So rather than thinking you have to play all 12 of them or something, and certainly rather than thinking you play them to show off your technique, it's really an impressionist, it's a set of impressionist paintings to try and play with, but at a time of war. Thank you.
Perhaps another question? Okay, let me ask.
Please.
It seems from the methodology that you, aside from doing the background, and there was a lot of letter,
yep.
Archival research in learning a piece, right? And it's good to forward what is happening around the composer's life, having cancer, internal conflict of the body, as well as external conflict in the world. Now, how do you, of course, the technical knowledge is there, but how do you, of course, you have to internalize all of those when you perform. How do you step back? Because some younger performers might not be able to come around and get out of that zone.
Yeah. So I think it gets to a point where, really importantly, you have to trust you've done that work, and that there's too much in your head and your body and your heart and your spirit and everything in real time that you could have conscious connection to it. So it's all about trusting in a state of flow, which is whatever is meant to be most present in the moment. Some of it will come through, and therefore, so I'm spending a lot of time on this, just even in terms of thinking about curriculum. We only need to study one thing in music, and that is music. Because in music you can find all of life, and life you can find things that come into music. But in a contemporary world, we have to find ways of subdividing it, at least in Western thought, into things that are their own little boxes. And one, just taking your point there, one that I'm really working with is you have to make the music, which is going to be physiological and organizational and so on. You have to be inside the musical materials. You have to be really looking at why is it, as Debussy says, the satisfaction of putting the right note in the right place. So that sense of understanding as much complexity of oral theory or whatever, and then there is everything that is around. And it's not as simple as he was ill, therefore he writes dark music. In fact, in his situation, he's doing the opposite. Everything is dark, so he's trying to gift light. The same as Schubert. When Schubert was dying at the end of his life, everything is dark internally. It's literally palliative care to himself, in Schubert's case, to write music, because when he's thinking about the music, he's not thinking about his own pain or darkness or whatever. But I think that you end up, you can go very deeply, and you can't possibly know everything that was happening in 1915 and 1916 in France, in Debussy's life, in everybody's life around him. So there's a never-ending possibility of learning more. And I think to answer that thing of being overwhelmed, what it ought to do for us all as performers is make us humble. Because we've got no chance. You can't project everything that is possible in the music. You have to trust the music. So you get out of the music's way to let the music give a little bit of light to humanity in the moment that people are listening. People I know who've been to lots and lots of concerts, not as musicians, but just they come to music. One or two of them who I've asked, why do you come? And the answer has always been, it gives hope. So in terms of music, conflict and harmony, I think what Debussy was trying to do here was to gift hope at a time that in every sense seemed hopeless. And that sense of that we can only do little bits in our time. So how to get away from getting too emotive, involved, let the ego go, trust the flow, do the homework, and be humble.
Many words of wisdom this afternoon for our young student musicians, as well as for those of us who are already in the field.
Thank you for coming, all of you.
When was this piece written?
1915. 15, 16.
Is there any piece that he is also working on?
Yeah, he's actually, he did these ones really fast, so these 12 etudes came all of a sudden out of the blue. He was actually also, because the other thing is we think of composers like Debussy's a composer. No, Debussy's a father. So there's a picture you'll see tonight of him with his daughter. Debussy is an editor of other people's music, so he was actually working on the Chopin etudes and complete works at this time. So there was this whole thing of trying to write etudes when so many other people have done them before. He began to write 3 sonatas that would be where he was seeking to be different. You've also got to remember that by 1915 the Rite of Spring is 2 years old. Dissonance is everywhere. Cubism is all around you. Charlie for Chaplin films are everywhere to see. The juxtapositions of conflict between Charlie Chaplin films that you can go and watch tonight after you've read the news of how many people have been killed in northeast France yesterday. These juxtapositions were all around. So yeah, it's a time where he was writing, and some of the pieces he was writing were deliberate homages to people who were killed in the war, or pieces that might inspire, almost like provocative pieces. If you want to see something really amazing, if you're a pianist, Kirill Gerstein has released a double album with a 170-page book notes, which is called Music in the Time of War. And it's the music of Debussy and somebody called Komentov, who Debussy knew, and he wasn't killed in the Armenian genocide, but he ended up in an asylum as a consequence of the impact of it on his life. So there's a piece of incredible art that came out of COVID that I would really recommend to go and have a look at. And there is a pianist who certainly can play the piano, but who has done incredibly deep diving into this thing of what's inside and what's around the music. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think it's almost time for dinner, but we hope to see you later and hear this possibility of hope in times of war. Thank you very much. Let's give Dr. Lanskey a warm applause.